You know the name, Sackler. In America today, that name is not just a label for a family. It is a symbol of a specific kind of evil. The kind of evil that wears a suit and tie. You have lived through the last 20 years. You have seen what they did. You watched the news reports. You saw the devastation in rural America. Maybe you even saw it in your own neighborhood. Purdue Pharma, OxyContin. They didn't just sell a painkiller, they sold a lie. They told doctors it was safe. They told regulators it was non-addictive. And while they made billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives. But that is not the part that makes you truly angry, is it? The part that makes your blood boil is what happened after the money came in. They didn't hide in a bunker. They didn't run away. No, they wanted you to admire them. They took that blood money and they carved their name into stone. The Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Sackler Gallery in London, Sackler medical schools, Sackler libraries. They bought respectability. They used charity as a washing machine for their conscience. They wanted history to remember them as philanthropists, not as drug dealers. And for a long time, it worked. The system protected them. The lawyers protected them. The politicians protected them. Because in the modern world, if you steal $100, you go to jail. But if you steal $1 billion and destroy a generation, you get a museum named after you. It feels unprecedented. It feels like a unique tragedy of the 21st century. It makes you wonder, has the world lost its moral compass? Is this a new low for capitalism? The answer is no. This is not new. This is not an accident. And the Sacklers were not the inventors of this business model. They were just amateurs, copycats. If you really want to understand what happened to America, you have to look back 180 years to a different empire and a different drug. Imagine a family, even richer than the Sacklers, even more powerful, even more connected. They didn't sell pills. They sold opium, thousands of tons of it. And just like the Sacklers, they built an empire on addiction. Just like the Sacklers, they knew exactly what their product did to people. And just like the Sacklers, they washed their reputation with massive public charity. But there is one terrifying difference. When the truth about the Sacklers finally came out, society turned on them. Their names were scrubbed from the buildings. They were dragged into court. They became pariahs. But this family, the family we are going to talk about today, the Sassoon Dynasty, they were never dragged into court. They were never shamed. Instead, Queen Victoria invited them to the palace. The British government gave them medals. They were knighted. They became sirs and lords. Why? Why was one drug family treated as criminals, while the other was treated as heroes? Because the Sacklers were just a greedy corporation, operating inside a country. But the Sassoons? They were the engine of the country itself. Their drug trade wasn't a crime. It was economic policy. It was the only thing keeping the British Empire from going bankrupt. To understand the opioid crisis of today, we must uncover the fiscal folklore of the 19th century. We must look at the ledgers, we must look at the silver, and we must answer the dark question: what happens when a government decides that the survival of its currency is more important than the survival of its soul? The year is 1830. If you looked at a map, the British Empire seemed invincible. The sun never set on its territory. Its navy ruled the waves. Its factories were the engine of the world. But if you looked at the ledgers, if you looked at the bank accounts in London, the empire was bleeding. It was facing a financial crisis that threatened to destroy everything. And the cause of this crisis was not a war. It was not a famine. It was tea. The British people were addicted to tea. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Every factory worker Every aristocrat drank it by the gallon. But there was a problem. A fatal flaw in the global economy. Tea only grew in one place, China. And the Emperor of China had no interest in British goods. He didn't want British wool. He didn't want British clocks. He famously told the King of England, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance." China demanded payment in only one thing, silver. This created a massive problem, a trade deficit. Every year, millions of pounds of tea flowed into London, and every year, millions of ounces of silver flowed out. Imagine the British treasury, like a bathtub. The tea trade was pulling the plug. The silver was draining away, eastward, and it was never coming back. This was a catastrophe. In the 19th century, money was metal. When you ran out of silver, you ran out of money. Without silver, the banks in London would collapse. Without silver, the Royal Navy couldn't be paid. The entire British economy was on the verge of a liquidity crisis. It was about to freeze. The British government was desperate. They needed a product, any product, something that the Chinese people had to buy, something that would make the silver flow back to London. But what could they sell? What product creates its own demand? What product, once you buy it, do you need to buy again and again and again? They found the answer in the poppy fields of India, opium. Now, understand this clearly. This was not a secret operation. This wasn't a few criminals smuggling in the dark. This was a state-sponsored enterprise. The British East India Company, which was essentially the government, controlled the production. They monopolized the fields in Bengal. They processed the drug. They packed it into wooden chests, stamped with the company seal. But there was a legal problem. Opium was illegal in China. The emperor had banned it. Trafficking it carried the death penalty. So, how does a civilized empire sell an illegal drug without getting its hands dirty? They needed a middleman. They needed someone smart enough to run the logistics, ruthless enough to break the law, and loyal enough to serve the crown. They needed the Sassoons. David Sassoon, a refugee, a brilliant financial mind, fleeing persecution in Baghdad. He arrived in Bombay, just as the British were looking for a partner. And in that moment, a deal was struck. A deal between the crown and the merchant. The empire would provide the product and the protection. The Sassoons would provide the distribution. And together, they would reverse the river of silver. They would save the British pound by addicting an entire nation. David Sassoon. He was not a warrior. He was not a politician. He was a middleman. But he was the most efficient middleman the world had ever seen. When he arrived in Bombay in 1832, he saw an opportunity. The British East India Company had the monopoly on growing the opium, but they needed someone to move it, someone to finance it, someone to take the risk. Sassoon didn't just build a business. He built a machine, a vertically integrated global corporation long before the term existed. They called him the Rothschild of the East. Let's look at the mechanics of this machine, because it was a masterpiece of logistics. First, the product. Opium is fragile. It spoils. And the journey from India to China was treacherous. Typhoons, pirates, and the deadly monsoons, which stopped all shipping for months at a time. Sassoon solved this with speed. He invested in a new kind of technology, the opium clipper. These were the Ferraris of the 19th century seas. Narrow hulls, massive sails, built for one thing only, speed. While other merchants waited for the winds to change, Sassoon's clippers cut through the waves. They could sail against the monsoon. They delivered the product, fresh and fast. It was the Amazon Prime of the drug trade. But logistics was only half the battle. The real genius was the finance. You see, opium farming is expensive. The farmers in India needed money for seeds, for land, for survival. They couldn't wait until the harvest to get paid. So Sassoon became their banker. He created a system of credit. He advanced money to the farmers. He locked them into debt. He ensured that they could only sell to him. And on the other side, in China, he set up banks. The Sassoon family opened branches in Canton, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong. They didn't just sell the drug. They handled the currency exchange. They insured the cargo. They controlled the money, from the moment the seed went into the ground to the moment the pipe was lit in an opium den. It was a perfect circle. The silver flowed out of China into the Sassoon banks. Sassoon took his cut and sent the silver back to London to buy tea. And the tea flowed back to England. The trade deficit was fixed. The British pound was saved. The Queen was happy. By the 1850s, the Sassoon family was wealthier than most European royalty. They controlled 70% of all opium traded in the world. Think about that scale. Imagine if one family today controlled 70% of the oil trade, or 70% of the internet. They were untouchable. They were operating above the law because they were the law. But there was one problem, one obstacle standing in the way of this perfect machine. The Emperor of China. He saw what was happening to his people. He saw the addiction, the poverty, the ruin. Millions of men wasting away in opium dens. A generation lost. So, he did the only thing a sovereign leader could do. He said, no. In 1839, the Chinese government seized the opium chests, thousands of tons of it, and they burned it. They dumped it into the sea. It was a stand for dignity, a stand for public health. But to David Sassoon and to the British Empire, it was not a moral victory. It was destruction of private property. It was an attack on free trade. And when you mess with the money of the empire doesn't send a lawyer. It sends a gunboat. The First Opium War. History books will tell you it was about trade rights. They will tell you it was about diplomacy. Don't believe them. It was a war for silver. It was a war to force a customer to keep buying a product that was killing him. The British Royal Navy arrived with iron hulls and steam engines against wooden junks and swords. It wasn't a war, it was a massacre. They bombarded the coastal cities. They seized the ports. They forced the emperor to sign a treaty at gunpoint. Not only did China have to pay for the war, they had to pay David Sassoon $6 million silver for the opium they had destroyed. It was the most profitable war in the history of the British Empire. And with that victory, the Sassoon family moved their headquarters. They left the heat of Bombay for the mist and rain of London. And this is where the story gets truly interesting. This is where the financial folklore becomes a lesson in modern PR. Because David Sassoon's sons didn't want to be known as drug dealers. They wanted to be gentlemen. They were incredibly rich, richer than the bankers, richer than the aristocracy. But in Victorian London, money wasn't enough. You needed class. You needed a clean name. So they built a reputation laundromat. Does this sound familiar? Does this remind you of a certain family in New York? The Sassoons started giving money away. Everywhere. They built hospitals in India. They built libraries in London. They sponsored art galleries. They became friends with the Prince of Wales. Arthur Sassoon hosted the King of England at his country estate. They went hunting together. They drank tea together. Tea paid for by the addiction of millions. The newspapers stopped calling them opium merchants. They started calling them philanthropists, pillars of the empire, the merchants of the Raj. Queen Victoria herself knighted them. Sir Albert Sassoon, Sir Edward Sassoon. The drug money had been washed clean. It had been turned into titles and estates and respectability. Look around London today, you can still see their name on the walls of museums, in the history books of great institutions. Just like the name Sackler was carved into the walls of the Louvre and the Met and Yale. Why do they do this? Why do men who make their fortune on human misery crave your applause? It isn't generosity, it's insurance. Philanthropy is the premium you pay to buy silence. It is the tax you pay to society, so they don't ask where the money came from. For 100 years, it worked for the Sassoons. They became part of the British establishment. They married into the Rothschild family. They entered Parliament. They proved a dark truth about our financial system, a truth that Richard Sackler would later rely on. If you make enough money, the crime disappears. The origin of the wealth is forgotten, and the drug dealer becomes a lord. But there is a flaw in this plan, a fatal flaw in the logic of easy money, something that neither the Sassoons nor the Sacklers saw coming. The money doesn't last. The Sassoon dynasty seemed invincible. They had the money, they had the titles, they had the favor of the queen. But empires built on destruction always have an expiration date. By the early 20th century, the opium trade was finally outlawed. The easy money stopped flowing. And what happened to the family? Without the constant injection of drug profits, their influence began to fade. The later generations didn't know how to build anything. They only knew how to spend. They became famous for their parties, their horses, and their eccentricities. Today, the Sassoon name is just a footnote in history books. A name on a few dusty buildings in London. The Rothschilds of the East are gone. And the Sacklers? They are watching their own empire crumble in real time. Their company is bankrupt. Their name is being chiseled off the walls. Their legacy is one of shame. So, what is the lesson? What is the fiscal folklore here? It is simple, but ruthless. You cannot build a sustainable economy on a product that destroys your customer. Whether it is an empire selling opium to China or a corporation selling opioids to America, the result is always the same. It creates a short-term boom, followed by a long, painful bust. It enriches the few at the cost of the soul of the many. The British Empire learned this lesson too late. America is learning it right now. History doesn't just repeat itself, it screams at us. And the only way to stop the cycle is to listen. If you believe that understanding the past is the only way to fix the future, then you have found your home. Join us at Fiscal Folklore.